Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Duncan, and I'm a librarian in the Children's Literature Department of the Los Angeles Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us today for the book Bridge, Connecting Generations Through Literature. This event is being recorded, so you can watch the video later or share it with your friends. If you're watching us live, you'll need to be logged into YouTube to post your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them during the program. This event is a collaboration with the Writers Project of Ghana, and we're honored to have several distinguished Ghanaian authors here today to discuss their writing for children and young adults. I'll introduce everyone, and then I'll hand things over to our moderator to begin the discussion. First, Elizabeth-Irene Baitie is a multiple award-winning author of 8 books for children and young adults, including Crossing the Stream and its sequel, Flying Up the Mountain. She weaves her tales at night, and by day, she is the director of a medical laboratory. Nii Ayikwei Parkes is a multi-genre author writing across poetry, radio, fiction, and children's writing. As an example, you can check out an ebook of his Ga picture alphabet on LAPL's Libby app. Next, we have Mamle Wolo, a multi-genre Ghanaian German writer born and raised in Ghana. She is the author of The Kaya Girl, a beautiful middle grade novel published in Ghana in 2011 and in the US in 2022. Her newest book, Flying Through Water, was published this year, and we're eagerly awaiting for it to arrive on the library shelves. You can place a hold on it now to be the first one to read it. Finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Isaac Quist. Isaac Quist was born and educated in Ghana. Starting out as a teacher of English, language, and literature, he has enjoyed an extensive career as an educator in Ghana and well beyond. He believes deeply in the power of language to unlock learning and unleash creativity in transformational ways. Isaac, would you like to start the conversation?
Thank you so much, Laura. Good morning, everyone. It is not every day we get these 3 powerful authors in the same room. So I'm expecting a lively hour, and I hope you are too. We're going to run this in a particular way. We're going to give each person an opportunity to give us a reading from their preferred text. So, this is a lovely treat for you listeners and the audience. And then they will give us a bit of a synopsis of the text from which the reading is made. They will also begin to make the initial connections between the text they've chosen and their writing generally and the theme for this morning. So without any particular method of choosing, I'll probably invite Mamle Wolo to begin.
I'm not going to say why me. I'll just get on with it.
You will not get an answer.
I'm going to read from Flying Through Water, which came out in May this year. It was published by Little Brown Books for Young Readers. The story is about an intergenerational, it's about an intergenerational cycle of poverty that was created partially through the conversion of the Volta River to a lake in order to power the Akosombo Dam. Villages that were evacuated and populations downstream whose lifestyle and livelihoods were altered by the creation of the dam. Some of their descendants are now working on the lake as children involved in fishing labor. Sometimes some of these children are trafficked. Some of these children are treated very harshly in their work. Our protagonist is called Senna, and I'm going to start reading from the time that he, as a trafficked child, goes out on the lake for the first time with his boatmaster. This is from chapter 14, page 158 of Flying Through Water. This time we were with the master, and the mood in the boat was different. There hadn't been much talking before, but the silence hadn't been as total or as tense. The only one who seemed at all at ease, and if anything to have acquired a bit of swagger, was Yao. I dreaded the moment the engine's hum would stop, because no one had to tell me there could be no escape for me now. 3 stumps came into view, with some of the long-necked waterbirds perched on them. They took to the skies as we went by, and I wished they would take me with them. It was the master himself who cut off the motor. Go, he commanded. Every single boy jumped into the lake, and there was no one left to blend in with, and nothing to look busy about. Yao stayed above the water, supervising, while the others dived down. I sat miserably on my plank as the master watched them get to work, wishing I knew how to make myself disappear. He turned around. Ah! He spotted me. And you, what are you waiting for? He peered closer. New boy, didn't you hear? He jerked his head towards the water. In. But I had no idea how to continue, what I could possibly say. Anger gathered quickly in his face. Are you disobeying me? He poked his chest on me, and without waiting for an answer, stood up and grabbed me by the shoulders. Stop wasting my time. He shoved me over the edge. I gasped as I hit the water, which made me inhale it and lose all control. I thrashed my limbs in desperate abandon as it streamed into my nose and mouth, stifling me, seeping into my very pores, weighing me down. For all my mad flailing, I felt myself sink as surely as I was trying to rise. A rough pair of hands pulled me up. Yao. He dumped me on the floor of the boat, where I convulsed, vomiting water, gari, and weevils as my lungs fought to expel death and inhale life. Massa, this one of the swimming, I didn't say. Maybe we can tie a rope, went the master. What has time for that? Do you know how many other boats are out on this lake? Have you seen the Chinese trawlers? We'll learn faster this way. He grabbed me by an arm and leg and threw me back over the side. Sink or swim, he jeered. I sank and was hauled out, choking again. By this time, some of the others had returned to the surface, and some were back in the canoe, a growing audience for my humiliation. As soon as I could breathe again, I felt a searing slap across my face. What is wrong with you? Bellowed the master. He stood over me, belly overhanging his shorts, hand raised, ready to slap me again.
Hi, I think there's a little bit of a technical difficulty with Mamle right now. Should we move on to our next author and we'll come back?
If Elizabeth-Irene is ready, I would say we try that.
Right. Thank you. So I am going to be reading from Crossing the Stream, which is published in the US, is published in Ghana, is published in the UK, and is published in Italy as well. Crossing the Stream is a story of 12-year-old Ato. Now it's set in Ghana, and in the story, 12-year-old Ato is very keen to win a competition that will help him gain entry to the prized, beautiful, beautiful bird island of Noma, and that's an island that his father helped to build. Now, Ato has to create a community project and win the project in order to gain entry onto the bird island. And in the meantime, he also has to go spend time with his grandmother. Now, there's an interesting dynamic going on in his family. His father has died, and this grandmother is his paternal grandmother. His mother is deeply suspicious of his paternal grandmother. Now, I have this situation where in my story, I am pulling on situations in Ghana where people become afraid of what they do not understand. It's a part of our culture, which unfortunately surfaces all too often and opens the way for suspicion and also all sorts of superstitious beliefs to cloud people's judgment of each other, to infiltrate relationships. Ato's grandmother is trying to build a relationship with him, and he's spending the weekend with her. So against the backdrop of Ato's mother having said all sorts of things about his grandmother, Ato has gone to his grandmother's house. He hasn't felt very well. His grandmother has received him for the weekend, and I start to read from where she cups her hand around his face. Ato, she said, you're hot. Where does it hurt? He brushed his hand across his forehead and his neck. Here and here. It felt like a big hard soccer ball was being pumped up in his head. Large drops of rain began to slap at his skin, and Nana grasped his limp wrist, led him indoors, and bundled him into his bed. He slept and woke again. He was freezing, then burning up, then shivering again. And through it all, the soccer ball in his head kept inflating. His grandmother hovered around like a great formless shadow. She's got you now, he thought. You're trapped, Ato. Run, run. He was hallucinating, he knew, but he couldn't help the thoughts in his fevered brain. He couldn't control the pathetic way his limbs shuddered. The front door opened, then shut. She'd left him alone with his terrifying imaginings. The rain pounded a steady rhythm on the roof. Outside his window, the wind whooshed through branches with the force of a river. A flood was approaching, like the night his dad was born. But instead of being born, he was going to die, he thought. He had to be careful, very careful. He had been warned. Nana would push him into the rushing water to sacrifice him. He would be washed into the forbidden stream, and he would drown there along with the sheep. His grave was waiting. The front door opened again, and the roar of storm winds crashed through the house for a moment, then was abruptly cut off. The door had been shut. His grandmother was rubbing his shoulders to wake him. His mouth was full of bitter sawdust. He wanted to keep lying down, to close his eyes, but she wouldn't let him. She was propping him up on a footstool, and steam was rising into his face. A pool of dark water formed before him, with floating leaves and branches. She was bending him over, pushing his head down. She wanted to force him in, to drown him, he thought. He struggled, trying to fight her off, but her hands were too strong, her dark honey hands that could handle any problem, including a boy who didn't want to die. He whimpered, losing hope, as she draped something soft and heavy over his head. Everything went black. It was hot. She was going to cook him. Steam filled his nostrils, his lungs. He struggled against her, but those strong hands would not let him go. A faint hint of bitterness hit the back of his throat. Shh. She wanted him to stop fighting. She murmured something about Nii. Nii, her potion. Be careful of her potions, he had been told. He writhed beneath the dark covering, but she was holding him down. Breathe in, Atu, she coaxed softly. He bucked feebly, trying to throw off the heavy cloth. Shh. And she was stroking his shoulders. Her whisper sounded like the rustle of breeze through leaves. Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in. There was no fight left in him, so he breathed in and out and in. His pajamas were clinging to him. Gentle hands replaced them with dry ones. A warm hand caressed his forehead. And he blinked, and then the darkness was being chased away by sunshine. There you are. His grandmother sat on a stool by his bed. Beside her, the sun shone warmly through the voile curtain. Her hands were curved around a bowl with a spool sticking out of it. You must be hungry. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that moving reading. I don't know why both you and Mamle have chosen such harrowing, incidents to begin. And but I think it gives us a very good introduction to the dynamics, as you describe it, of relationships in the text. Now, yes, you do make the connection to the fear of the unknown, as it were. And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to look at some depth in the presence of the supernatural and religion and all of that, and how it shapes, life and living in this place called Ghana. So thank you very much, Mamle. I'm sorry, Elizabeth. Mamle is back. Would you want to continue? Can we hear you better now?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I'll just continue. So Sana has just been thrown into the water. So yes, I'll just go back slightly. I sank and was hauled out, choking again. By this time, some of the others had returned to the surface, and some were back in the canoe, a growing audience for my humiliation. As soon as I could breathe again, I felt a searing slap across my face. What is wrong with you? Bellowed the master. He stood over me, belly overhanging his shorts, hand raised, ready to slap me again. I was stunned, speechless, blinded by the sting on my wet cheek. Don't you want to swim? He asked, as if I had tried to drown for fun. Incredulously, I detected mirth in his voice, and sure enough, he started to laugh, cueing the others. Some joined in. It hurt more than the slap. I raised my shaking hand to my face. No, I don't want to swim, I thought. I want to fly. Fly like a bird. Fly away from here, away from you, away from all the troubles of this life. I was glad my face was still covered in water, so my tears were indistinguishable. Massa, I beg, give him a break, said Yao. I knew it was he who wanted a break from hauling me out, and also that it would only last until we moved to our next workstation on the lake. I crawled to my feet and huddled among them, taking refuge in the lonely space beneath their cheers. That day, I was thrown back in so many times, I lost count. Each time I panicked and filled my lungs and stomach with what felt like half the lake. My insides burned from my nose and throat down to my lungs. The boys took turns hauling me out, dropping me into the boat like a bag of rubbish, never even making eye contact. When I finally passed out during a coughing fit, I was left alone, and when I came to, we were heading for the shore. I stayed where I was, crouched at the bottom of the boat with my eyes closed. I couldn't bear anyone looking at me anymore because even their glances felt like assaults. It didn't help that I stank of the filthy, fishy water in the boat, which had dried and crusted over me. The horror of self-revulsion, of wanting to get away from myself, made me try to will myself out of existence. What would my schoolmates think now? Senna the sprinter, Senna the striker, so useless in the water. I'd never be Senna the swimmer. As for Kelly, I wouldn't even allow my mind to go there. I tried to think of Togbe instead, but as my filled with the water being bailed out of the boat, I felt as if of the failure I was in this, above all as the grandson of a fisherman. I hope you heard the end of that.
Yeah, we did. We did hear the end of that. Thank you very much. You seem to be having problems still with your sound. I don't know what
Yes, I
can
may
be
need to
done about
move. Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
But did you get all that? Was that
I think we got about 98% of that, so that's pretty good
okay?
going.
I,
Thank you very much. Again, the introduction to Senna, and I'm interested if you've chosen this particular point of entry for people who might not have read Flying Through the Water. Is there a particular reason?
I just thought it was a dramatic connection with the story. If I could only read for 5 minutes, it's kind of in the middle of the book, and it's kind of central. It's when Senna's life completely changes from a boy living with his family to a trafficked child working on the Volta Lake, and it's the beginning of the hardest part of his life, really. So yes, I thought it was a middle point that would give readers a good idea of the book. Yes.
And it's such a violent piece, and I'm wondering, is the kind of violent relationship between adult and child, would that be typical, or is there any reflection you'd want to have on that?
I think to me it's slightly Dickensian. I mean, I think Senna's story is slightly reminiscent of the likes of Oliver Twist and David Copperfield, in that he's a child that goes through hardships that children should not go through. And Dickens was writing at a time when children did go through such hardships in England. And in Ghana, children are going through such hardships today. And so I think it is a part of our culture, whether we like it or not, that the hierarchical nature of our traditional structures, they can lead to abuse. I'm not saying that they are designed for abuse, but they can lead to abuse. And abuse kind of, it happens quite often, and it happens quite easily as a result of the hierarchical structure of our societies in Ghana. And so to me, it's perhaps a more brutal side of culture, because culture encompasses so many things. And it's also something that I felt I would like to bring to the attention of people for discussion. I think that that's one thing that books can do, and for children to also know children in Ghana to know that there are children who are going through things like this, and for adults to know. So yeah, these are some of the reasons why this novel is perhaps more brutal in some ways than The Kaya Girl, which was the one I wrote before it.
So thank you very much. It's interesting to have this coming against what we have in Crossing the Stream, and there's a different kind of violence. Again, it's intergenerational. It's built. It's made up of different factors, but it is there, and we will probably have an opportunity to explore that further. Let me go now to, so Mamle, thank you very much. Let me go now to Nii Ayikwei to share with us what he's chosen to share, and I'm sure he will give us reasons for what he's sharing and make connections to why we're here.
Hi, good morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you might be in the world. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to be reading from a book published by Puffin Classics called Tales from Africa. I think it's available anywhere where the English language works, because Puffin is one of those huge publishers. I'm reading, so this was commissioned to kind of retell stories from around Africa, and I'm reading from a story that's from Ghana, but is not an Anansi story. So one of the things I did was try not to take from the cliched stories, and this is called Kokonsa of Asantemai, and it's an adaptation of a story that I was told. So in the story, what you need to know is there's a hunter called Poku who set a trap, and he in the trap catches a rat, a snake, and a man called Ko. He's very hungry and his wife's farm isn't working very well. When he gets to the trap, they all ask for mercy. So he frees the rat and the snake, who are very apologetic and offer gifts. And Ko, the man who he rescues, is very sullen and just walks off. Later, as part of the gifts of the rat, Poku gets a little wealthier than he was. Then the king, the Omanhene of Asantemai, loses some gold, and Ko suggests that probably it was Poku that stole the gold, and that's why he's become rich. So Poku is arrested and he's on his way to be executed. He's been taken to the square when this part of the story, this is where we jump into the story, and I'm going to read from there to the end. So there's a crowd gathering. Suddenly, there was a disturbance from the back of the crowd. The executioner stopped dancing, and a woman came running forward, crying out loud that the Omanhene's wife had just been bitten by a snake. All the chief's guards and executioners were ordered immediately to fetch the best healers to save her. The executioners tied Poku to a pillar in the public square and went off, leaving one guard to keep an eye on him. The most famous healers and herb experts in Asantemai went to the Omanhene's palace to try to save his wife. But they all came out after a few minutes with her and said the same thing. The venom was too strong. They could help her live for a few more hours so the Omanhene could say goodbye to her, but she would surely die. When the sad news reached the square, Poku overheard the guard and remembered the antidote that Snake had given him. He tapped the guard's shoulder. I think I might be able to help the Omanhene's wife, but I will have to go home first. The guard knew that the Omanhene considered his wife irreplaceable. She was his best advisor and his most trusted confidant. The Omanhene would rather lose all his possessions than lose his wife. So the guard agreed and escorted Poku back to his house to fetch the antidote. At the palace, Poku examined the Omanhene's wife and turned to face the Omanhene and his linguist. I agree with the healers, my great leader. She will not live, he said. But all the while, he was really thinking of a way to punish Ko for his false accusations. You are our last hope, said the linguist. Something must be possible. The hunter nodded. She will not live unless I strengthen this antidote with a special ingredient. What do you need? Cried the Omanhene. Anything you need, you can have. Poku was silent for a moment, surprised that the Omanhene had addressed him directly. I need the skin from the forearms of a treacherous man, he said. Is this a riddle? Asked the Omanhene, close to tears. Where will I find a treacherous man? The guard who had escorted Poku home stood up. He had seen how the people of the hunter's village had come out to embrace Poku because of his good deeds. As he couldn't address the Omanhene directly, he whispered to the linguist, The linguist addressed the Omanhene. My chief, sometimes a lie is the truth facing the wrong direction. Your humble servant asks that you consider that the thief who stands before you, he pointed towards Poku, might be innocent and a good man. The Omanhene frowned for a while, then nodded slowly. That would make Ko, his accuser, a treacherous man. The chief lifted his right arm to summon his men closer. Guards, go and bring Ko and skin his forearms. With the skin from Ko's forearms, Poku applied the antidote to the snake bite, and within minutes, the Omanhene's wife was able to open her eyes. Attendants wiped the sweat dripping from her forehead, and soon she was sitting up. The Omanhene was so grateful that he wanted to reward Poku, but the hunter refused. Your wisdom has spared my life, said the hunter. I need nothing more. And would you like me to punish Ko? Oh, it's not necessary, my chief, said Poku. He has been punished enough. So Ko continued to live in the kingdom of Asanteman. He was still rude and still spread rumors and gossiped about other people behind their backs. Of course, his forearms healed, but they didn't return to the healthy brown color they were before. They stayed a sickly red, and when children saw him, they would chant, "Shwene Nsakoko, 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 Kokonsa, Kokonsa," which means look at his red hands, red hands, red hands, red hands, hands red, hands red. They said it so fast that it began to sound like Kokonsa, Kokonsa, Kokonsa. And that's how Kokonsa became the word for a treacherous person or a gossip in Asanteman. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, a lie is the truth facing the wrong direction.
Yes.
That's a wonderful one. What would you make of that whole scene in terms of larger questions around culture that we are trying to reconnect African children to? I mean, the writer, we've often been reminded, is also a teacher.
Yes.
So what's going on here?
Well, I mean, this is an adaptation of an earlier story, and I made the end up, the kind of the Kokonsa thing, but it goes back to my concerns with language and actually teaching our children how much philosophy goes into a language, how etymology works. I mean, that's not the real origin of the word Kokonsa, but with a story like that and the fun that it is to kind of make that up, kids then ask their parents where other words come from. So like somebody might say, why do we have a word asori? And then they might explain, you go to church, the organist plays and people stand up, asori, and that's why we call it church asori. And so then people begin to understand the beauty behind the language, the philosophy that guides the creation of language. And that is something that people can move forward with, even if they don't really know the language. But hopefully it gets people to want to learn the languages. So that's one of my concerns. Also within the story, as you can see, the hierarchies that Mamle is speaking about are there. The linguist can, the guard can't address the Omanhene directly. The linguist has to speak to the Omanhene, but protocol can be broken when it needs to be broken. So this is one of the things that people tend to forget about our cultures, that they're very adaptable. At least they were until the encounter with colonialists, where then they, in order to defend themselves, they start to calcify and become rigid. But these were communities in transition. And I think a lot of the world is in love with the narrative of Africa being static. And even the notion of how people think of where people may have come from on the African continent. And they say, your ancestors are from Nigeria. Well, we didn't have those borders, right? And there was always a lot of trade right across West Africa, Central Africa. And so people were moving, DNA was moving across the continent. So all of these things, they come from a conceit that standardizes or thinks of Africa as a static thing. What I'm trying to show through the stories is that it's never been static. And yes, these other things have come to influence us, but we will continue to evolve. And the same structures of hierarchy, etc., yes, they can be misused, but the same structures also allow for correction, because there's always somebody more senior than somebody else.
Wonderful. And, thank you for foregrounding, some particular perspectives around culture. And I think, to carry on, it'd be useful if, each of you just shared what for you, that whole concept of culture is. What are its main ingredients for you? What, must we absolutely retain in terms of a conception of culture, and especially as it plays out in some of your own work and in other work that you are familiar with. Mamle.
I think culture is a system, or let's say cultures are systems that people around the world design to make life livable, as it were, to make life practical, livable, and to kind of bring it under control, and to be able to plan and also contain, let's say, elements that could be troublesome. So I think that's why culture intermeshes with religion, for example. Sometimes people can no longer tell where culture ends and religion begins. So I think it's about behavior codes. It's also about celebrating what is the positive things in a given area. It's about networking and creating social networks and societies that can support, where people can support each other. It's about using the environment that people find in their corners of the world, using the particular environment, circumstances, foods, and so on to create things that are particular to them. And I think that what must be retained, if one wants to continue speaking about culture, is what makes you different from other cultures. And I think one of the reasons why we chose this topic is because we feel, well, I certainly feel, and this is a concern I probably addressed through my writing, that in a country like Ghana, we are hemorrhaging culture in the aftermath of colonialism, and let's say with the onset of new types of colonialism from other parts of the world. We are giving our culture away freely without understanding what we're losing. Because it becomes more cool, especially for young people, to espouse cultures of other parts of the world. And I think as a result, many young people are growing up without being connected to markers of culture that existed in the previous generations. And I think books and stories are they're really receptacles of culture. They're the sort of trunks of culture that you can open and dip into. And if you make them exciting, it's a sort of painless way for young people to become immersed or to get to know aspects of culture of their parents or their grandparents that they might otherwise not connect with, because they're living in a world that is more influenced now by other cultures that are outside of their borders, that may be far away, maybe continents away. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sure both Elizabeth-Irene and Nii Ayikwei would want to build on that, interrogate that in some way. So I don't know which of them is ready to go now.
Well, I will say, from Crossing the Stream, I explore the intergenerational connection between Ato and his grandmother. And coming from my background, where I was very close to my grandmother she was a treasure trove of wisdom. And she had a particular respect for the land and for the earth and for the healing that came from the land. And in my book, in the particular chapter that I read, Nana is treating Ato's fever with a neem steam, which those of us in Ghana are quite familiar with. During COVID, it was quite a popular treatment or prevention against COVID. But my grandmother would, if I stepped into my grandmother's house and sniffled or clutched my tummy with a tummy ache, she had some herbs, some leaves, something she would boil up for me to drink. And they were usually quite effective. And so in my book, I'm hoping that children will understand the wisdom of the elders. Now, we have a particular respect for the elderly in our culture, but sometimes that respect can lead to, as Mamle said, that respect can lead to abuse. So in my story, we also have a prophet of fire. I don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't read the story, but Ato is as a result of his mother's reverence for this prophet, Ato is unable to question certain things that he finds questionable about the prophet's behavior, and his association with his grandmother increases his courage and enables him to be able to explore an area where typically in Ghana a child would not be able to explore. So in my book, I'm looking at how the culture is questioned. A child can actually ask an elderly person questions in my book. I would like children who read my book to feel that you can ask questions. You don't need to be stifled. Atu's grandmother brings that up quite often. We explore fear in here because in our culture, fear unfortunately is also used to control people. I'm not sure. I'm sure there were all sorts of dynamics that led to that sort of situation. But we do have a situation where, as a result of fear, people will not ask too many questions about certain traditional things or certain mysterious or superstitious things. Atu's grandmother helps him to unravel all of those. So I am hoping that we're going to have children who read us looking at tradition and culture in two different ways, as areas where we have something to hold on to, something that is precious, that is the learnings from the land, the learnings from the ancients, and also question the stories of fear and the areas where you are not allowed to ask any questions, being able to open up those areas for questions in children.
Thank you very much. And just go back to a bit of an observation that Mamle made about cultural hemorrhage. And I'm sure Nii Ayikwei might want to pick us up on that. But then I'm sitting here wondering, among a certain group of people, do we have it to give away in the first place? You know, it's something that would probably want to exercise as a bit, but you know, not to circumscribe what Nii Ayikwei would want to talk about. Let's leave him free to explore where he wants to take the question.
I mean, I don't think culture is something that you can necessarily give away. If you don't practice it, it loses its potency. But essentially, even when we feel like we're disengaging from culture, it still affects us. There are things that, people who think in places like Ghana, and again, I don't really respect the borders because they're just random things that were drawn up in Europe. Our people are all over the place. But, there are people who claim to be very strictly Christian or Muslim or whatever, and then certain things happen, and you see them revert right back to the things that we did before we were colonized with these religions. So it means that even without practicing those things, they have remnants of a philosophy or practice that they've observed that influences how they behave. Now, what becomes dangerous is if you don't know why you're doing it, then you can become didactic about, I don't want you to wear something that is that short, and you don't know why. And so when the child asks you, you yell at them, and that starts to break the relationship. Now, originally, we're very dialogic cultures. If you look at the way in which justice was done in most West African settings, what would happen is the person who was wronged was brought, to the Council of Elders, and they would say, what would make you feel satisfied that justice has been done? Now, you counter that with Western justice, which is, and I put that in inverted commas because we're watching what's going on all over the world. And you have, that's actually designed to protect property. So they're like, if you do this, this is the punishment, regardless of the reason. There's an old document that was written after the Quran Fuga, which was in the Malian kind of charter of law, in which they say actually that if somebody steals and it's because they're hungry, it's not a crime, right? So this was written in the 15th century. Now, if you look at that, there's so many people who wouldn't be in jail right now because it would be taken into account, what the realities of life are. And I think those are the things that when we lose, I worry about. Of course, I mean, we're losing languages because people don't realize the value of language. Like one of my favorite words in Ga is Lamnu, right? Which is the word for the color gray. Now, if you break it down, it's la, fire, nu, dust, fire, dust. is the word for the color gray, which is when you burn the ash that's left there, that's the color, right? What it tells you is that these are people who observe their surroundings, learn from them, and do something. Now, even with geography, you look at a place like Tema, which comes from Teman, the land of stones. So think about it. And then there's Teshi, which is beneath the stone. So if you know the Ga language and somebody asks you, is Teshi far from Tema? You know it's not, because Tema and below and Teshi, so the stone and below the stone must be close. So these are the real treasures of our cultures. The things that Elizabeth-Irene's talking about, that the herbs, all those things, some of those things are also caught up in the language, just in the way that things are named might tell you what healing they can give. And so if we discard all of these languages, things, healing for diseases that we have, that we've been dealing with for generations, will go. And now, because we're in a globalized world, some of the diseases which were thought to be just ours and therefore could be ignored are traveling to other parts of the world. And if our remedies are not known because we've lost our languages, or we haven't spoken to our elders, or we've disdained them, we're not listening to them, then those things will be lost, and then the whole world becomes in peril. So culture for me is the ultimate ways, or the optimal ways that we find to live together. Now, the way that culture has been affected negatively is, rather than finding optimal ways of us living together, what we've now moved to, and we've all been educated into, and sometimes we have to educate ourselves back out of it, is these are proper ways to live, which have been written down by somebody else, which is a totally utopian, extractive idea. And then we all have to live by it. And therefore, we start to suppress culture because we say, oh, you can't be sitting down to listen to stories with your grandmother because you need to sleep at this time, because in the morning you have to do this before you go to school. Now, in those storytelling times, that's actually where we learn the things that Elizabeth-Irene was telling us about. Because when we're doing storytelling, the analysis stories, whatever the stories were, the kids are encouraged to ask questions during the story, because the stories were how we taught. So they had the freedom to ask the questions, they had the freedom to even imagine different things happening in the stories. And the masterful storyteller would rope everything in together. So that's what I think you lose without practicing the culture. But I don't know if you can give the culture away. People can observe things from our culture and copy them and use them commercially. But culture is not something that you exploit commercially. Culture is something that you live, that you adhere to, that you, yeah.
Thank you for that. And, thank you for the wonderful history lesson. I'm sitting here thinking about, I'm sitting in Tesano as you talk about Tema and Teshi, and within Teshi you have Tebibiashi, yes, and all kinds of. So look, I get that. But I think we're on a kind of loss and retrieval kind of trajectory here. And I'm just wondering, do we always, or is it useful always to locate culture in a past, in a vanishing past, in a disappear? What kind of practices are we evolving that also rightly belong within the sphere of culture, and which you guys are engaging with in the kinds of things you do? Anyone at all who feels?
Well, I would say, in a short answer, one of the things that is part of a new culture that we're doing is writing, because the way in which we share stories was just by telling them, right? Now we're recording them as text, now also as little reels, videos. So that's part of the evolution of culture. It is how we're sharing these bits of information and wisdom and insight.
Yep. Anybody else wants to weigh in on that?
I think culture is necessarily dynamic. I mean, it's something that is changing all the time, just like language itself. It's inevitable that culture changes all the time. But I think also that world cultures are slowly being homogenized, especially through American culture, which is so dominant because it is so marketed all around the world. It's, even through through social media, networks, advertising, and because we share a language, the English diaspora, if you want to call it that, is kind of unified by this language, and therefore we receive pop culture in all the languages in all the countries where English is spoken. And because English has now become the sort of dominant language of the world, even if you don't speak English in your country, right now I'm in Germany and just shocked how much English is spoken here. And I mean, I've been coming here over the years, but it's increasing. So I think in some ways it's useful for culture to become homogenized because we can move more easily across the world and understand each other, and share things like currencies and lifestyles and so on. But at the same time, that's where we start to lose what made us different. So I think there are advantages and disadvantages for sure. But because it's also changing so rapidly, and when I say people give it away, I really mean they just don't value it. I mean, not that there's somebody who is going to receive it, but by not valuing it, for example, parents not passing their language to their children, even in Ghana. So one of the things that has shocked me is that between my generation and my children's generation, many Ghanaian children are just not being taught. They're not even talking about outside of Ghana. So you're getting children in schools in Accra, who speak only English. You're getting like monolingual children in Ghana speaking only English. And to me, that's been quite shocking because when I was in primary school, every child spoke their indigenous language in addition to English. So to me, that's a huge thing to happen within 1 or 2 generations. It's not more than 2. And that's when I talk about giving away your culture, because you don't understand the implications of that, of not passing on something as fundamental as language, which is one of the biggest repositories of culture that there is. So I think there are pluses and minuses. I have to really be aware of those pluses and minuses and the implications.
Thank you. Elizabeth-Irene, is there anything you'd want to add, or can we move forward? I see the time is
Right, yes.
going as we get
yes, we can move forward, yes.
Okay. It's very interesting to listen to all of you again, trying to change the whole continuity and change thing, and how we navigate that. But I know we're also in danger of moving a bit farther away from your actual work. But a lot of the commentary you've made in the last 5 minutes about the need to retain and to reconnect takes me back to Nii Ayikwei, and I know he has a dictionary in Ghana. Talk about the motivations behind that, and as well as the aspirations for it.
I don't have a dictionary. I mean, I wish I did. I have a picture alphabet for kids, and the reason I created that was going back to what I said earlier, is to kind of bring back the fact, or to highlight the fact that the languages are actually fun and really interesting, but also to present the alphabet in a nicer form. The Ghana Education Service has always produced language books, but they're in black and white and not exciting at all for kids. So I wanted to create something where there was some dynamics within the text, and so it gives us it's just a starting point, and I think it's an important starting point. The next thing I'm going to do is kind of maybe something that plays with etymology a little bit, but I think that's what we're doing in all of our work, because as Mamle suggests, if you don't practice the culture, that's when you lose it. Because actually, when you practice it, it becomes part of world culture. I mean, we're seeing that with Afrobeats now, right? People are using chales all over the world, and that kind of thing. So I think I don't think we're completely lost. I just think that if we bring the pride back, then we have enough to restart. Even when we're just speaking English, to be honest, because I've seen my friends' kids only speaking English, but they still use their cras and their Ys. So it's an it's a Ghanaianized or Asante-ized or Ghana-ized or ever-ized English.
Don't land us in Kumerica before you're done. No, but an observation for our audience, we noticed that there's a lot of, agreeable commentary going on. We're hoping that you'd throw some questions our way. So please don't be shy. You've got something to ask. Please feel free. Um, but whilst we're doing that, I noticed we only have about 10 minutes to go, and I wanted to give an opportunity for you to. We have talked a lot about the children and respect and power and hierarchy and all of that. We have made some commentary on religion and the supernatural. I wanted to talk about, the whole notion of class and how it plays out in your works. And, does class produce culture? Does culture produce class? How do you see the two working together? Do they undercut each other? Do they reinforce each other? Go back. I'd like the audience to get a feel of your own
Yeah.
books. So if we could root the conversation in your books, I'd be grateful.
I mean, I would just give the example of the story I read from. So there's a chief, there's a linguist, there's Ko, who's the gossip and kind of does his thing. He's a farmer as well. And then there's Poku, who's a hunter. Now, all of these people have a role in society. I think class always exists because if you have leaders, then you have class. Now, what differs across cultures is how much responsibility for others less fortunate than yourself that you have with that class. And I think that that's where the shift has been happening. And I think we've lost a lot of the responsibility that comes with it within our cultures because of the ways in which colonialism kind of interacted with our local structures of authority and class.
Thank you. And Mamle, Elizabeth?
Elizabeth, you first.
Yeah, well, I would say class, perhaps to a certain extent, influences culture. In my story, there are two distinct cultures between the children. That we have Ato, our main character, growing up in a middle class setting, and his grandmother introduces him to life on the other side, literally on the other side, because there's a forbidden stream in the story, which actually takes me back to my childhood because we grew up not too far from Nima, and there was a stream that was filled with all sorts of unmentionable things. And just because it was a forbidden place, we like to go there to play and just have a peek at what was going on the other side. And there definitely was a difference in the way people dressed, the way people lived, the way people spoke, the way people ate, and so forth, and even the kind of food that they ate. So there is a difference, but I think that there's something beautiful about introducing children to different cultures, as it were, between the classes. That happens in my book when the grandmother takes her grandson Ato across the stream to taste and smell and see and have an immersive experience in life across the river. There is a difference, and it would be a beautiful thing if children were able to connect with each other across cultures, because even though there are differences, there are also a good number of similarities. And we find my main character enjoying food from across the stream and finding it very, very much to his taste indeed. So yes, there are differences, but that does not make those differences negative. These are differences that can be enjoyed by both sides across classes.
Thank you, Mamle.
I think in my novel, The Kaya Girl, I have explored the cultural divide, which is also a wealth divide, really. I mean, we could say that the wealth divide is almost parallel to a cultural divide because on the wealthier side of this divide is far more Western influence, far more secular education, literacy, and the use of the English language and exposure to Western culture through, let's say, the tools of technology, which of course are more accessible to wealthier classes. And on the other side is more retention of culture, sometimes even simply through economic pressure. So, for example, people will use traditional cures for illness because they cannot afford to buy pharmaceutical medicine, or they cannot afford to go to the hospital. And so I think the wealth divide and the cultural divide operate in a parallel system. And I think through my novel, The Kaya Girl, I've tried to show that it's not necessarily that either side is good or bad, but it's inevitable that we will have now it is inevitable. Perhaps 400 years ago, culture was much more homogenous, but we now have almost two different worlds, or more than two different worlds in one country, because of the way culture operates across the wealth divide. And so there's good and bad on both sides, and if you bring them together, I think that's the strongest option, because you need children of today to be able to relate to two cultures if they're really going to call themselves Ghanaians, and to be operative and to be able to succeed in modern Ghana. People need to also understand Western culture. They need to be able to operate in that world. So it's a two-way street, and both are necessary and both are inevitable.
I mean, it raises all manner of questions, but I wouldn't go there now. I know we have very limited time. Just a final one. We've kind of skirted around it. Marriage, family, kinship. All of those sorts of things. What's the take you have on them in your books? To what extent are your own perceptions influenced by your position across the divide, if you like?
When you say divide,
we've been talking about the class divide, the economic divide, that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, I find a really interesting dynamic around my two grandmothers. My father's mother is probably 15 years older than my mother's mother. And yet they grew up in completely different Gold Coasts, let's say. And again, I kind of resist the whole thing of Ghana because we have so many languages, we have so many cultures. So when we're actually talking about complexity of cultures. I did my national service in the north of Ghana. It's completely different in how people approach and people's connection to their language and stuff like that. So sometimes the narratives that we are talking about are very Accra-based. And yet we also have in Accra people who are still very connected to the villages. They'll go to the villages on the weekend. So there's this whole kind of range of things. Anyway, back to the grandmothers. My father's mother was of the generation where if you didn't like a man, you left him. And there was no, so many women of that generation, when you talk to them, they had kids with different men and vice versa. And then just a little below my mother's mother, they're very church, and it's like, till death do us part, and I'm sticking with this one, regardless of what he does in the streets, right? And so that generation gap for me is really interesting. It tells you all about how colonialism affects the dynamics within which we grow, and what we witness and can write about and talk about in our work as we go forward.
Thank you very much. And I think we've probably on the verge of running out of time. I'm going to invite Laura back in to, round this up for us. And hello, Laura. Are you ready for us? We can't hear you.
Awkward mistake. Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful discussion. I feel really inspired and excited to read all of these books now. One of the commenters during the program said, "Thank you all for bringing our world closer together," and I'm really feeling that today. I want to be sure to thank again the Writers Project of Ghana and our panelists and moderator for such a rich discussion. You can find more literary events on the library's YouTube channel or at lapl.org/events. Any last thoughts before we say goodbye?
Let's go around the table quickly. Nii, let's start with you this time.
Elizabeth-Irene, I've spoken a lot.
Okay, so he's palmed it off to you.
Well, I would just like to say that I hope readers enjoy a taste of Ghanaian culture through this and are able to find connections with their own culture, intergenerational relationships, those wise talks with grandma and with granddad. There's so much wisdom to be passed down, just wisdom about everything. So I'm hoping that this will encourage intergenerational relationships as well.
Thank you. Mamle, quickly.
Ditto.
We asked for it. Nii Ayikwei.
Well, I guess I'll do this. saying.
Well,
No, thank you very much, Isaac, for leading us so
Yes.
masterfully, and Laura for introducing us with such verve, even though you haven't had some of our wonderful Ghanaian sun and food.
we should bring her home.
Thank you all. All right, see you next time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody.